All right, we're ready. There we go. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, guys. I'm Abigail Bunt, and I'm co-founder and executive clinical director of MeBe. As Katie said, thanks so much for joining us today. We're really excited to have Bianca Rodriguez and Emily Neuhaus with us, sharing this information with you guys. And I'll just start by introducing you guys to MeBe. Okay, you can go to the next one. Thanks. Okay. So MeBe is all about being me. We integrate research-based strategies of ABA, speech therapy, and occupational therapy with intense personal attention to provide those therapies that's engaging, flexible, and customized to your child's needs. So we really want to make sure that we get to know your family, your child really, really well so that we can tailor our interventions to maximize the progress for your child. Okay, and so we have several locations across California, Washington, Arizona, Texas, Colorado, and Virginia. And we offer ABA therapy, speech language therapy, and occupational therapy. And we are introducing diagnostics in Texas in the next month. So that's really exciting. Okay, and I will turn it over to Emily.
Hello, my name is Emily Neuhaus. I am an assistant professor at the University of Washington in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. And I'm also a clinical psychologist, and I see families at the Seattle Children's Autism Center, where I do mostly diagnostic evaluations. And so in those couple of roles, I work with families in a few different ways. So that most immediate one is, again, helping families figure out if autism is a fit for them. But in terms of research, I work a lot with families trying to understand more about autism, what the social and emotional experiences of people with autism and their families are like, and learning more about that. So those are the different perspectives that I'm bringing to this time today. Next slide, please, Bianca. Thank you so much. So in the time that we have, I have a couple of different things that I'm hoping to talk about. So the first one, and sort of the big question, is what is autism spectrum disorder? And on the face of that, that might seem like, just a one sentence answer, but there's a lot to it, right? What is it? What does it look like? What do we know about it? What is important for families to know about it? And what are some of the things that are out there that are not true that you might also hear? So that is a main piece of what I'd like to talk about today. And then we're going to talk more specifically about research. So research is obviously really critical to our understanding of autism. But there are some really specific examples that I'd like to call out where I think the role of families in motivating and participating in that research has been really key to moving the field forward in ways that are super important. So we'll talk about that. And then finally, we'll talk specifically about a study called SPARK, and Bianca Rodriguez, who's joining us, will also tell us a lot about SPARK in details and how folks can get involved. It might sound familiar, you might have already gotten involved, which is great. And if not, we would welcome that. So we'll spend some time talking about that today. And through all of this, I'm happy to have questions. So we'll have some time at the end for questions, and I'll also try to stop periodically, but feel free to pop questions into the chat and somebody can just interrupt me. I won't be offended. So feel free. Next slide. Oh, thanks, Bianca. You're ahead of me. Okay, so the first thing that I really want people to know about autism, and that I think sometimes families already know, is that autism is a description that has a lot of variety and diversity within it, right? So there's the saying, I don't know if it's a cliche for other folks, but there's a saying in the field that if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism, right? So there's so much difference. And every person with autism is similar to some people, to other people in some ways, but they're also very unique in other ways, right? They share some things with other folks that make that autism description apply for them and for other people. They have some things in common, but they're also very unique and very much themselves, right? So two people can both have autism and be very different. And we often talk about autism as being a spectrum. So it's in the name now. It wasn't always, but it is now. And that spectrum really is an effort to appreciate that diversity and that sort of variety. Folks can be at one end, can be at the other end, can be anywhere in between. And that is all good. So So I like to be super clear about that. Next slide, Bianca. Thank you. So in terms of the official pieces of it, what's the language that we use? Because that has changed over time, right? So autism itself was first written about in the 1940s or so. A couple of different researchers and doctors in different parts of the world actually both kind of landed on these groups of kids that seemed to have some things in common. And they wrote about them and said, I think this is a thing that exists. Let's start studying it. And that was just the 1940s, which is not really all that long ago. And they landed on the word autism to describe that. And then that's changed a lot over the years. So our diagnostic system gets updated periodically. And so the words change as the science changes. So at the bottom of this sort of funnel here, you can see Autism Spectrum Disorder. And that is our official term now. So we often abbreviate that with ASD. So that is what you likely are hearing and seeing and reading about these days. And, of course, we all use lots of acronyms and abbreviations. So ASD, Autism Spectrum Disorder, that's the official. If you look above that, though, you can see there's this kind of cone or funnel, right? And it's got different words in it. So these are the words that we used in the last version of our diagnostic system. So these words are from before 2013. So some folks with younger kids may not have come across these at all, but folks with teens or who are reading or watching things from before 2013, you might be coming across these. So autistic disorder, Asperger's, PDD, which stands for pervasive developmental disorder, which is a mouthful. All of these were words to describe the autism spectrum in different ways. And the deal with this was that, as a field, as professionals, as parents, as teachers, I think we all knew that autism was a spectrum, but there was a thought that maybe within that broad spectrum, we could find subgroups. So maybe, we could find folks who had similarities in certain ways, and we could call that Asperger's. And maybe we could find folks who had similarities in other ways, and we could call that autistic disorder. And maybe those subgroups would be helpful in understanding either, how kids were developing, what supports might be helpful for them, or what things might be like for them later in their life. Right? So the thought was that by breaking down the spectrum into these subgroups, we could get some useful information and be more helpful in more specific ways. But it turned out that, based on the science, as great as those goals were, it turned out that that subgrouping just didn't work as well as folks had hoped. So it wasn't actually helpful to know kind of which of those separate 3 descriptions was describing a child to know where they were going to end up longer term. So when the system was revised in 2013, those words were dropped and autism spectrum disorder became our official term. So, that's where we've landed. I will say, that's not without controversy, of course, and there are some folks who still really identify with the idea of Asperger's, and that's okay. So you might come across that out there, and that's fine. It's just not an official phrase that you'll see anymore. Thanks, Bianca. So that diagnostic system I was describing, how does it describe autism? What is autism? What are we looking at when we think about whether it's a fit for somebody? So we've got 2 big categories of behavior and development that we pay attention to. So this diagnosis is based on a person's development, their skills, and their support needs in those 2 big areas. And so you can see here we've got, one big circle that has social and communication features in it, and one big circle that has interests and play and sensory experiences and flexibility in it. So we can talk about them each. So on the first side, we think about that social and communication piece. That is really a core of autism. This is a piece that if you've got that diagnosis of autism, there's a lot going on for you probably in this circle. So social reciprocity, what is that? Right? That sounds like kind of a jargony term, but it's really a back and forth. In my mind, it is how attuned your brain is to the social parts of your world versus the non-social parts of your world. So if you think about babies from super early in life, you might remember that they tend to watch other people's faces and are more interested in looking at faces than other pictures often. They tend to make eye contact pretty early. They tend to smile back if you smile at them. They're watching people, they're trying to imitate them. That's really drawing their attention and holding it. So that's like the very early kernels of that social reciprocity. And then as they get older, that starts turning into conversation skills, approaching other kids on the playground, having an interest in the kids and the adults around them, right? So it's really being drawn to that social side of things. Whereas a brain of a child who might have autism later or might receive that diagnosis later might also enjoy those things, but might be equally drawn to the objects or the non-social things in their environment. So an example that I hear sometimes is parents who tell me, when I called his name, he didn't seem to hear me. We thought maybe there was a hearing difficulty, right? But when the refrigerator clicked on and made a little humming sound, he seemed to hear that right away, right? Like that was a brain that's sort of weighing the social and the non-social things a little bit differently in the world. So that's kind of that piece. And you can see how that builds into relationships, right? If you are approaching people on the playground and you're really paying attention and getting lots of practice socially, you're going to more easily build relationships and develop those kinds of selective friendships with other kids as you grow and then into adulthood, right? So it's really tied in there. You're also thinking about nonverbal communication over there. So that's things like eye contact, gestures, facial expressions, all of those pieces that we use to communicate in addition to our spoken language that really, again, help build those relationships, help practice those social skills, and really tie all of that together. So that's the social side of things there. And like I said, that's really the core. If we don't see sort of difficulties or differences in the development of those things, autism is generally not a fit. On the other circle here, there's a little more variety. So these are things like super intense interests. So I have Minecraft on there because that's one that I hear a lot about from families that I work with. Kind of goes through phases, right? Sometimes I used to hear a lot about Thomas the Train or Pokemon or different video games depending on the ages of kids that I'm working with. But Minecraft is a perpetual one, I think. So these are interests that are not just hobbies or things that people enjoy. These are super strong. So it could be that they are, pushing out other things that kids could be learning and doing, right? It could be that it's getting in the way socially because other kids don't want to talk about that as much, right? Or it could be that it's something that is really interesting to a particular person, but not really to other people their age. So sometimes this ties into this next one here around repetitive play. So you can see that little picture of a kiddo who's fallen asleep with their toys lined up. So there's an element of repetition or sort of not as much variety in play sometimes. We sometimes see repetitive language where somebody might repeat themselves, repeat other people. We sometimes see repetitive body movements. This can be a common one. Sometimes when people see that, they think, autism pops into their head pretty early. We also think about sensory experiences. So autism can come along with, sort of a difficulty tolerating different kinds of sensory experiences like textures of food or clothing. It can come along with interest in sensory experiences like wanting to touch things or wanting to taste things that aren't food, wanting to listen closely to the sounds that electronic toys make, all sorts of different things. So those sensory experiences can be either way. It's a frequent target of occupational therapy for the kids that we work with here. And then flexibility. And so this can be, difficulties with routines when they need to be changed. It can be difficulties with transitions. It can be having kind of a hard time shifting your point of view or your perspective to somebody else's, right? So an example could be a child who has a really hard time if other people break the rules, right? It doesn't necessarily affect them, but it's hard to cope with the fact that other people aren't following the rules the way that they're written. or the way that they're understood, right? So you can see there's like more variety in that circle, right? And so this is one of the places that autism gets its variability from, because different people can arrive at an autism diagnosis with a different combination of difficulties in that circle. So I sometimes see kids where they've got difficulties in all 4 of those things, and sometimes where it's just 2, and sometimes it's somebody with the other 2, right? So this is one of those things that can be really confusing to families, I think, because they might say, you know, we've been told it might be autism, but we know somebody with autism and this doesn't look anything like it, right? And this is one of those places where I really like to highlight to families that there's variability here, and this is a spot of that. So you can see then that there's, you know, a lot that we look at there. And then there are also some things that don't go into that. So Bianca, if you would flip the slide for me. Thank you. You can see this is an image that shows us some of the things that sometimes come along with autism, but are not autism itself. And so sometimes one of these things in a circle on the outside there, the smaller circles, is what brings a family to their doctor or to me to say, is this autism? But then they're not actually part of autism. There's something that comes along with it. We often call it like an associated feature or something like that. So you can see autism in the middle. Some of the things that often come along with it, you know, in that top right-hand corner there is speech delay. So, you know, a lot of times kids with autism will have some difficulty learning to talk or communicate. Some will eventually use spoken, you know, verbal language to communicate. Some will use a device of some sort or a communication system. But speech delay is often a piece we see. We sometimes see a developmental delay or an intellectual disability there. We sometimes see sleep difficulties. That can be a real challenging one for families to cope with too, because that can be disrupted sleep, you know, for a long time, trouble settling down, tendency to wake up during the night or get up really early. We sometimes see challenging behavior. So sometimes that can be around aggressive behavior or really big tantrums. Sometimes it's self-injurious behavior where a child is hurting themselves. So that's another real stressful one for families. Sometimes we see seizures or epilepsy. Sometimes we see ADHD or attentional difficulties. Sometimes ADHD is what's on people's radar first, and then they come to us to see if autism is in addition or instead. Sometimes we see eating or feeding difficulties. That can be things like very selective diets or difficulty tolerating textures of different kinds of food, having really specific requirements. Knowing one brand of mac and cheese versus another mac and cheese by taste, right? It can be super specific. Sometimes we see GI concerns, gastrointestinal concerns, and that can certainly tie into that sensory and feeding part. Sometimes we see anxiety. That's a pretty common one, especially amongst our older kids with autism. And sometimes we see mood difficulties, so depression or other types of dysregulation that can be, you know, feel pretty problematic for families as they're trying to support their kids. So how common is autism? You may have heard this thought that autism is increasing, right? The numbers seem to be going up over the years. So that's a tricky question. And I told you it was first recognized in the 1940s, and for several decades it was thought of as being very rare. So it was not to be common at all. It was a really rare thing. But that's changed a lot. I think it's had a lot of, you know, there have been a lot of sort of publicity campaigns. There have been some famous folks who helped sort of spread the word about autism. And our research has done a lot to, that has contributed to these numbers. So these numbers that you're seeing here are coming from the CDC, and they collect a lot of different kinds of data, but they give a new updated estimate of autism every couple of years. And this particular image was created by Autism Speaks. So if you look along the bottom, you can see the different years, right? It goes from 2004 to 2020. And then if you look at the pink line, you can see that it's increasing over time. So back in 2004, 1 in 166 children in the United States was estimated to have autism. And so that is what if you have a class of 30 kids, that takes 5 or 6 classes to find one child with autism, right? And then if you look at, right in the middle there, 2012, 1 in 88 kids, that takes maybe 3 classrooms to find one child with autism. And now if you look at 2020, 1 in 54. So within 1 to 2 classes, we would find a child with autism potentially, right? So that really is going up in terms of the numbers. But why? We don't know fully. Is it really increasing? It could be. But I think there are some other things that are going into that as well. So one thought is that we're getting better at recognizing more subtle autism among the people who we would have missed before, right? So it used to be that the image of a child with autism was one specific sort of example of what that would be like. But now I think we have a better appreciation again for that spectrum and that variability. So I think we're able to pick up more of those kids. We're also, doing better at getting the word out to families and to primary care providers, right? So that there's more screening, there's more awareness, there's more referring families for evaluations when they need it. And then a third possibility is that there really is some increase in the rate of autism in the world. And I think that's possible. We don't know for sure. I think it could be true. It looked like there might have been a question that popped up in the chat. Is there, do we want to pause for a second?
There was a question adding echoclia, covering textures, mimicking behaviors, and saying the last word of a phrase.
So that sounds like echolalic speech. Maybe
Okay.
That's part of that repetitive speech piece that's in that diagnostic picture. So yep, that is something that we see, that echoing back right after somebody has spoken. Like a classic example is a parent who asks, do you want milk or juice? And a child might say milk or juice, right? And so it often does have like a communicative purpose and is helpful for a parent who knows how to interpret it. But it is a little bit different style of communicating. Yeah. Okay, so we were just talking about sort of the rates of autism and whether there's been an increase, but another kind of mystery is why it's diagnosed more commonly in males than females, because it definitely is, right? So some estimates say that there are 4 times, or 4 males with autism for every female with autism diagnosed, right? And then a study in 2017 called a meta-analysis that looks at, a whole bunch of studies put together, estimated that it's probably closer to 3 males for every female with autism. And that's still a lot. And you can see in that image, that little graph there, that it's showing over time the increase overall for autism, and that it's in both males and females, right? It's not just one or the other, but it's sort of across the board there. And we don't know why there is this imbalance in autism diagnosis. We think some of it, again, is that we're missing girls in some cases, right? Autism might look a little bit different, or what's really autism might be perceived as being anxiety or depression or something else, and autism might be missed. But it's also possible that there really is a difference in how often people are developing autism when they're male or female. We can't really say for sure. That's one of the things there's a lot of research interest in right now. So in terms of age, I keep saying kids with autism, and we often think about autism as being something that young kids have, but kids with autism typically grow up to be adults with autism. So on average, kids are diagnosed with autism for the first time between about 4 and 5 years of age. That's kind of the national average based on those CDC statistics. But that's just an average. So it can be much earlier, as young as 18 months, 24 months, and it can be much later, certainly into the teen years and adulthood, right? So, what autism looks like and, the process for evaluating it is going to be different at those different ages, but it absolutely is important to have that available to families and to adults themselves at some point, right? We often find that parents have concerns about autism for quite a while before that diagnosis takes place. So that can be, you know, that again, they've seen a speech delay or they've seen some challenging behaviors pretty early on, but it's taken some time either to get to the point of a diagnostic evaluation and that professional opinion, or that, you know, they may have received a different diagnosis in the meantime. Or it could just be that that is, you know, how long it took for things to clarify and become, you know, reach a point or a threshold where they could be diagnosed. We certainly also sometimes see kids where they're sort of coming along with their peers okay, and keeping up and doing relatively well, but then the social demands change or some demand in their environment changes. And then it starts to become apparent that there's a struggle in some area where it wasn't apparent before. So for example, a child moves from preschool into kindergarten, and now they're around a lot of other peers, and parents start to say, oh, something seems a little bit different, or this is something that could use a little support. Another point is that sometimes when kids go from elementary school into middle school, we'll see a little bit of that split as well. So all of those things are possible. And, you know, we're always hoping to provide the supports that a family needs regardless of the diagnosis that they have. But those are the things that we're paying attention to at those different ages. So I want to shift and talk some about research, but I think this is also a natural time to pause and see if there are questions from anybody, either in the chat or that they'd like to kind of pop out at this point.
Let's see, I don't see any other questions yet, but if you do, just write them into the chat box or the Q&A and I can see those as they come in.
Okay, super. So, you know, like I said, a lot of,
Sorry about that. We did get one just come through.
yeah,
how can we get children diagnosed sooner? Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah. One thing I would do is for a parent, for a particular family who might have a concern or wonder about autism, there's a great tool that you can use online for free that's called the MChat. And you can get to it by Googling MChat or by going to Autism Speaks and looking for MChat. And the thought there is that it's a screening tool that asks questions that can point to autism. It's not super specific to autism, but it's a really nice starting point. And it's something that you know, is recognized by a lot of professional organizations and professional groups. And so it's the kind of thing you can fill out for your child, bring it to your doctor or your primary care provider and say, this is a concern I have. I filled this out. You know, what do you think? There it is. You know, say, you know, what's the next step? What should we do? So I would say that's one piece. Ideally, primary care providers should be doing some screening automatically at particular well-child visits, often like a 24-month well-child visit, around 30 months, 36 months. So we need to get the word out to primary care providers and help support them in screening for autism so that kids can move into services more quickly and parents can get some answers if those are concerns that they have. It's a great question. Okay, keep typing them in if they're coming up, okay? So we're talking about research, you know, sort of underlying all of this because that is, you know, how we learn about autism, but there are a couple of places where I really want to think about research in a really specific way as it relates to autism. So that's what I'm going to talk about next. So if we could flip to the next slide. Thank you, Bianca. When I say research, you might think about scientists in lab coats, in laboratories. And yes, that's absolutely part of research. But you might not think about parents and caregivers and families of children with autism. And the reality is that parents and caregivers play a really big role in our understanding of autism. And they have historically been really important in sharing their observations, in motivating important research questions, and in organizing efforts to share that information more broadly. So some of the biggest and most influential organizations in autism research and advocacy that you might have heard of or that you might think of have been founded by parents or grandparents or siblings of people with autism. And some of the really nice resources around autism, you know, like books that have been published over the past decades have sometimes been published by parents just writing about their family's experience. So I think that's a really important piece to recognize. When we talk about research, it's a whole community effort. So I'm going to give you a really concrete example here about how families with autism have shaped our understanding. And this might be familiar to folks and it might not. So we'll see. But like I said, autism was first sort of recognized in the 1940s. And in the decades after that, as you can imagine, there was a lot of speculation and wondering about where autism came from, right? Just like we always wonder that about anything. How does it develop? What causes a person to have autism? And the trouble with this, in this case, is that two really big myths emerged, right? They're both totally wrong. They're both totally false, and they didn't have any support from science, but they really got big, right? They were out there. They're still out there sometimes on social media or from, I still meet families who have been given these messages somehow. And so I really want to be clear about it. What I'm going to tell you is false, right? These are myths. So the first myth was that autism comes from how a child is raised and how they're parented and cared for by their family, right? Whether they were paid enough attention to and things like that, right? That is ridiculous, right? It's totally false. Autism doesn't come from any parenting choices that parents do or don't make. Nothing that parents did or didn't do, right? Parents are their kids' and their parents and family members are their kids' best advocates and best teachers, right? And as you can imagine, that myth did a ton of damage, right? That's so harming to families, and really, it did a tremendous amount of damage, and it was always totally false, right? So the second big myth is around vaccines and whether they caused autism, right? And the tricky thing with that one is that sometimes people become aware of the features of autism around the same time that their kids are getting vaccinations, right? It all happens in early childhood. Science has shown that there is no link between them, and there never was a solid scientific basis to tie vaccines and autism together. And what we know is that autism doesn't come from vaccines, and that vaccines actually protect us all from pretty serious diseases, right? But again, that myth did a lot of damage. So what these have in common is that damage has been addressed by families and parents. So it's the power of families and parents who are really kind of debunking those myths and pushing the science forward, right? And so sometimes that's because they've founded or led those organizations that promote autism science. And sometimes it's because they were really good community organizers who got out there and said, this is a myth, it's not true. Let's find out what's really going on here. But either way, to me, these are really important examples of how families with autism were moving the science of autism forward in big ways. So with that context in mind, let's talk a little bit about actual causes of autism, or what the science has told us about it so far. So many things in our development come about through a combination of genetic factors, right, or genes, and environmental factors, meaning the things that we're exposed to in our environment. And in terms of autism, we certainly don't know all of the environmental factors that are part of it, but you can see a couple here. This image is from SPARK, the SPARK study that we'll hear about in a little while. So you can see some there on the sort of attached to the orange circle there. We don't know a ton, like I said, things like exposures to particular medications during pregnancy, but that's all. We're still figuring out all of those pieces. On the other side there is genetic factors. And this is a place where we've learned a lot over the past decade or two. And it sounds intimidating, right, to think about genetic factors. So let's kind of break it down. What are we talking about? What are genetic factors? What does that mean? It can mean a couple of different things.
Emily, don't want to interrupt you, but I think there's a couple of questions that came up.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Sorry, I had one question that was actually about receiving services. Said their son is 4 years old, diagnosed with ASD. How can I work with my son at home since we're still waiting for insurance to go through for ABA?
Mm. Yeah, so I may not be the best person on this panel to talk specifically about those services. And it probably depends on where you're located. But for a 4-year-old, I would be thinking about getting connected with your local school district to get some services in that way. So your school district can often do some evaluation and can do some support in terms of speech or occupational therapy or behavioral therapy that could be helpful in those ways. And that's sort of a different route than going through your private insurance. I would pursue both. But if you haven't tried that one, I would try that. I don't know if anybody else on the panel would like to pop in with an idea. There it is.
Sorry, it took me a minute to find the mute. I mean, I would also start there with the school district. It's not always immediate with them either. I know insurance takes time, and often the school does too. They like to do their own assessment. I'm not sure if you're receiving occupational therapy and speech therapy. Those are usually faster to get started because they typically don't require prior authorization. And a lot of people think that you have to go through an initial screening first, but you can actually just call and schedule your assessment for most commercial insurance carriers. I'm not quite as familiar with Medicaid for speech and OT. So those are great places to start. Because a lot of ABA companies have wait lists, I would also suggest that you call any in your area that you might be interested in and getting your name on those lists. That way you're not waiting for insurance to come through. And then once it does, you find yourself at the end of a long wait time. So I would definitely start there. Our organization does these webinars monthly with lots of great resources. We have a YouTube channel with great and easy strategies to work on language. Our director of speech language pathology does a lot of those for feeding as well. And I know that there are other organizations like Gus that are also doing parent webinars and putting out a lot of teaching strategies and information out there. Great question.
Okay. If there are others, feel free to pop in. Anybody. So, okay, so let's talk about this genetics piece for a second. Bianca, would you flip the slide for us? Thank you. So there are a couple of different things that genetics can mean. And I'm going to just say from the outset, like I said, I'm a psychologist. I'm not a geneticist. So, I'm not going to be able to answer really specific questions about this, although we could point you to folks who could if you have an interest. But you know, the graphics on this page are showing some of the ways that folks commonly think about genetics, right? The thought that it can be, when we say something is genetic, we mean it's passed down through families or it runs in the family. So in terms of autism, you know, there are certainly families where several different people in the family have autism, right? There might be multiple siblings in a family, or there might be a child plus like an aunt or uncle or a cousin, a parent or a grandparent. That's all possible. Or where, if not autism, something sort of related, maybe like a speech delay or a language or communication disorder, that's possible too. And so in situations like that, it's that there's some combination of genes that came together in a family that gave rise to autism for that particular child, right? So that's probably what we think about, or what a lot of people think about when we say genetics. Next slide, please. Thank you. But something can also be genetic without it running in a family or being inherited in any way, right? And so that is called a new or a de novo change. So whenever an embryo is conceived, there can be tiny changes to the genes and to the chromosomes that embryo will have. And so they get some genes from one parent and some genes from the other parent, but those tiny changes can happen when all of that comes together. So like we said, new or de novo, because it's new compared to the parents. Could be that nobody else in the family has that particular genetic change. And if it's a genetic change that gives rise to autism, it could be that there's no family history of autism. Nobody else in the family has had autism or question of autism. And it feels like it came out of the blue, but because it is connected to that little change that happened just for this particular child, and it's based in their genes, it is genetic. So that is, sort of one of the things we've learned in more recent decades, is that this is more and more a common scenario for people with autism. Sometimes it is that kind of genetic that runs in a family. Sometimes it's this kind of genetic. And sometimes a particular family might not know what the situation is for them. And it could be that the science hasn't yet figured out exactly what is going on for them. So that's sort of at the forefront. So as you can imagine, figuring out those tiny genetic changes and how they're related to autism takes a tremendous number of families, right? That is a lot of work and a lot of people. And that's especially true because science is telling us that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of different genes that can be related to autism. And scientists are working every day to figure out which genes this might be that are related to autism and how they work. And this is where that SPARK study comes in. So SPARK is an ongoing study of people with autism and their family members. And it's motivated by the hope of understanding autism more fully and helping to speed up the pace of autism research. And so I mentioned it earlier, but Bianca here on our team, who's so graciously been running the slides, is going to share more about the process of SPARK and how families can get involved and help keep moving that science of autism and genetics forward.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Emily, for your presentation. So hi, everyone. My name is Bianca Rodriguez. I am the clinical research coordinator on the SPARK study at the Seattle Children's Autism Center. So I'm going to be talking with you all a little bit more about the SPARK study today and giving you all a little bit more information about what participation in the study looks like. So as Emily mentioned, our mission at the SPARK study is to recruit 50,000 individuals with autism and their families in order to speed up research and advance our understanding of autism. And so at this time, we have recruited about 30,000 individuals with autism and their families, which we're really excited about. So individuals with autism, including adults, biological parents, and siblings, are encouraged to participate. SPARK currently partners with 31 sites across the country, including research hospitals and autism centers, and the study is currently on year number 7. So registration for the study is easy, completely free, and can be done entirely online. And SPARK has a 2-part consent process. So the first is the data consent. And so this includes completing surveys online. And the second piece is the genetic portion, the genetic consent. And so this includes completing surveys and providing a saliva sample. So if a family were to choose to consent to both the data portion and the genetic portion of the study, participants would be asked to provide a saliva sample using a collection kit that is shipped to your home, would be asked to also complete some surveys, and would be invited to participate in other studies that are relevant to them. And this is called Research Match. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. But essentially, what SPARK asks is just to be able to inform families of other research opportunities that might be relevant to them. And it's completely up to the family to decide if they want to participate in those opportunities or not. And as a thank you for participating in SPARK, participants do receive a gift card code valued at up to $50 once they've completed registration and returned samples that have passed quality checks at the lab. And there might be opportunities to earn additional gift cards for completing surveys that are assigned online as well. Another really cool fun fact that I like to share on this slide is that the SPARK for Autism website is a great and wonderful resource for families. SPARK also offers free webinars and lots of autism resources that can be super helpful. We recently did a webinar on autism and gastrointestinal challenges. So that was definitely a good one to check out. So yeah, I would invite everyone to check out the website just to look for additional resources. And so Emily talked a little bit about genes and genetic changes. And so SPARK is actually looking for specific genes in a participant sample that geneticists are certain are associated with autism. So at this time, Spark has a gene list of over 100 genes that geneticists are certain are associated with autism. And so that list of about 100 genes continues to grow the more participants participate in the study. And so that list can also be found on the website if you're curious. And I will note that Spark should not replace traditional genetic testing, as Spark is looking at specific genes only and does not do a full genetic workup of a family's genes. Okay, so this is a slide that I really like because it gives sort of a visual representation of what participation in Spark looks like. So the very first step to register for this study can be done at sparkforautism.org/UW. And the next step is to consent for the data portion of the study. And then families would enter basic information about themselves and their family structure. And then if a family chooses to do so, they would consent to the genetic portion of the study, also known as the consent for the DNA analysis. So once that DNA analysis consent or genetic consent is completed, that prompts Spark to send a saliva kit to your home. And I actually have the Spark box right here. So this is essentially what gets sent home. And the spit kits are located inside the box, and it has detailed instructions about how to go about providing that sample. And I do like to also mention that our team is happy to complete in-person home visits with our local Seattle families. Essentially what that looks like is we would schedule a day and time that works with you and your family, or myself or another coordinator could come to your home and support the family in the saliva collection process and get those kits mailed out for you. Of course, families can complete the study completely on their own and at home if that is what they wish. We just like to offer support if needed. And another cool thing we've been doing recently is offering virtual home visits. So if a family is interested in that, we're more than happy to accommodate. The next piece on this visual timeline is what we call the return of results. And so once kits are mailed to the lab, it takes at least 12 months for Spark to analyze those samples and report back to families. And it's really important to mention that not all families will receive a return of results. At this time, about 10% of our families who are participating are receiving a return of results. However, it does not mean that if you don't receive a return of results in the first year, that you won't get a result. So a cool part about Spark is that geneticists are continuing to analyze those samples every year. And so, for example, if there is no genetic result received in the first year, you might get a result year 2, year 3, year 4, and so forth. The last couple of pieces on this timeline are Research Match and Simon's Searchlight. So Research Match is what I mentioned previously. Essentially, Research Match is a service that matches qualified members of the Spark community to autism research studies that are applicable to them. And so it really offers the opportunity for participants and families to get matched with other research studies that might be applicable to them, that they might be interested in participating in. And again, Spark only asks to be able to inform families of those research opportunities, and the family can decide if they want to move forward and participate or not. And lastly, Simon's Searchlight is a research database for individuals who have received a return of genetic results from Spark. And these families may be matched with other researchers who are looking at that specific genetic change that they received the genetic result for. So this really offers a cool opportunity for families to build a community with other families who might have received a similar return of results. So let's see here. I just wanted to include this here. I know with the local MeBe Seattle site, we've provided some materials. And so if this postcard looks familiar, just wanted to kind of bring that up. This is Spark. We are talking about Spark, and this is the postcard that you might have seen in the lobby. And lastly, here's our contact information. The very first link is a red cap link. It's essentially an interest card. So you can fill that out if you're kind of thinking, I have some more questions. I'm not quite sure if I want to participate yet. You can fill that out and myself or another coordinator will be in contact with you to answer any of the questions that you might have. If after today's presentation, you're really excited to join Spark and you want to move forward with registering, you can go to this website here, sparkforautism.org/UW, and go through the registration process. And of course, if you have any questions or would like to reach us for any reason, our phone number and email address is here on the screen. And that's all I have for us. I do see there's quite a few things popping up in the chat. So I definitely want to address those.
Yeah, and I think, Bianca, maybe if you can mention the other locations. I know we have people from the Seattle area on the webinar, as well as some other locations as well. I did include the link to both the UW link and the main link as well. So maybe if you just want to talk about, for people who are maybe not in the Seattle area, how they might be able to get involved as well.
Yes, absolutely. So actually, if you just go to, let's see if I can go back here. Yeah, so if you are not in the Seattle area, in another state, you can definitely just go to sparkforautism.org. And you can go ahead and join the study if you'd like. And we do partner, like I said, with 31 sites across the country. And so you can, if you choose to affiliate with a different site that is closer to you. Some sites offer home visits or different support systems to help families. But yeah, definitely there should be a way for you to affiliate with a different site if you are in another part of the country. I think they do it by zip code.
Great, thank you so much. And I will mention to everybody here that I will send a follow-up email that includes these links as well. So you have them on the screen and in the chat, and just in case if you can't grab it, you'll get an email from me that will have the links as a follow-up to the presentation today. We did have a different question that came in during the presentation as well. If a child is given an ASD diagnosis when they are young, do they get reassessed when they get older? And if so, how?
That is a great question. So I generally do not recommend that families come back to be reassessed if they have an autism diagnosis. And part of that is because when we're evaluating for autism, we are thinking about somebody's development over time, right? And so what has happened before in a child's development won't have changed, right? New things will have happened, but the earlier pieces that autism diagnosis was based on are still there, right? So it's unlikely that a child would no longer kind of meet criteria for autism, if that makes sense. So that's kind of like a technical side of it. From a practical side of it, coming back to have a reevaluation to find out if a child no longer meets criteria is a little risky if you are relying on that diagnosis for the supports that you need, right? So I typically recommend to families that they just carry on, and if they think that their child no longer has autism or no longer would meet criteria, no problem. Pursue the supports that feel appropriate for your family at that time. But I don't routinely recommend that people come back for reevaluation.
I'd like to chime in from to just share the insurance perspective. There are funding sources that will require you to have the diagnosis confirmed every 2 years in order to continue to access your services. That's not necessarily the case for every insurance carrier out there, but there are quite a few that do require that. So you might be confused as to why they're asking that. They want to confirm that your child still qualifies so that they will continue to fund your ABA. And when I say that, I'm speaking about ABA specifically. It's not required to access speech or OT or potentially other services, but for ABA, there are some funding sources that unfortunately will require it.
I do see lots of thank yous coming into the chat box, and some people said they had to jump off. But we are getting some thank yous for the presentation. We have just a few minutes left today, so if there are any other questions, you can go ahead and put them into the chat box or the question box now, and we'll just give a couple minutes for the last few questions to come in. And in the meantime, like I said, I'll send a follow-up email with these links to everybody, as well as the link to the recording, so that you can refer back to the presentation as well. And I don't see any questions coming in yet, so I think we will prepare. Oh, sorry, one more just came in. Any suggestions for older kids? My son was diagnosed when he was 8, and now he's 16.
If the question is suggestions in terms of sort of supports, I would probably recommend that you talk with your son's teachers or current providers to help get an updated sense of what would be most helpful, right? Because again, so much variability, it's hard to say what's going to happen, what's going to be helpful for every 16-year-old with autism. So it's kind of a general thing. I would say at that age, you'd want to be thinking carefully about what's going to happen after high school. If that's where somebody is when they're 16, be working carefully with their IEP team to figure out what's going to be happening next. And if you happen to have kind of an autism focused provider that you see repeatedly over time, like we do here at the Seattle Children's Autism Center, I would recommend checking in with that person too, to get an updated sense of, what should we be working on now? What should we be thinking about for the next couple of years in the future?
Okay, looks like we're just getting a couple more. Let's see, what kind of sports can I get for my, I don't know, what kind of sport can I get for my son with ASD? I'm not sure if they're asking for a sport or a support.
I don't know either. I will say a lot of our kids really enjoy martial arts. A lot of our kids really, there's a lot of sort of routine and sort of self-discipline that comes with it. Seems to be a nice fit. Some of our kids do really well with swimming and running and things that give them some sensory input. So I guess if the question is about sports, I would say try lots of things and just see what your child gravitates towards, what they enjoy.
Perfect. Okay. Well, thank you so much. I think that will conclude our presentation for today. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us. I will certainly send the follow-up email today, as well as the link to the next MeBe Learning webinar next month. And maybe you can tune into that one if you're interested. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,